and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It is my great privilege and my great pleasure to be in conversation with Laleh Kalili this afternoon. I'm going to very briefly introduce Laleh, although perhaps you need a little introduction, such is your public life. So this series that the Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities are running are really about drawing attention to the significance of academic research to public life. So what better person to have in the room with us today than Laleh. So Laleh grew up in Iran and moved to the US in 1985, where she completed her undergraduate and postgraduate educations. She's lived in the UK since 2001 and has taught at SOAS and Queen Mary at the University of London, and will be the Al-Qasimi Professor of Gulf Studies at Exeter starting on the 1st of June. And I suspect I'm not the only person in the room today who is delighted, absolutely delighted with the prospect of you very soon moving down to our coastline. So Laleh's areas of study are the transnational politics of the Arab world, and she's the author of Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration, published with Cambridge in 2007, Time in the Shadows, Confinement in Counterinsurgencies, published with Stanford in 2013, and Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula, published with Verso in 2020. So that introduction, it focuses on the books, it focuses on a couple of movements in your academic life. But I'd like to open up the conversation this afternoon, perhaps by asking you to reflect upon perhaps the parts of your life, the movement in your life that actually brought you to academia, and that's kind of taken you through these various books and other publications and interrogations in your life.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and I'm incredibly grateful to you guys for having me and for even being interested in my pontifications. It's really lovely to be here with you and also actually to have a conversation that sort of ranges over a whole lot of different elements of an academic life, which I find particularly relevant today, given that we're all in a marking boycott, or many of us are in marking boycott, and with everything else that's going on in the British Academy. But to start with, I ended up where I am because I thought that I was going to be an engineer, and I got a degree in engineering for my undergraduate, and I worked as a management consultant for some years. And then I realized that I really didn't want to go to medical school, which was the original reason for doing engineering and taking organic chemistry and lots of other sort of pre-med courses. And so in a way, I, at that point, decided to do some sort of a degree that allowed me to be involved in, I thought, refugee logistics. So perhaps working with Médecins Sans Frontières or something like that, but on the logistics side. And when I started studying at Columbia for a master's program, it's a story that I've told a lot of times, but in fact, just recently I was rereading this book that I'm going to mention, and it became clear to me why I was so shocked by it. So the core course of the master's program at Columbia on human rights included some original readings, including the Second Treatise on Government by John Locke. And here I was, had grown up in a lefty family in Iran, thought that I knew everything about human rights, and it came as a major shock to me that sort of one of the foundational texts of human rights actually is entirely predicated on property rights, on the protection of property rights, and then the particular ways that this text in particular spoke about wastelands and the people who occupied them in other parts of the world. We know from the work of other colleagues, Brenna Bandar foremost among them, but many others, that in fact this is also a foundational text for settler colonialism, particularly in the Americas. But for me, it was also interesting because it was about several things coming to this realization, this epiphany. One was that the common sense of life, the common sense of politics, the common sense of political economy, in some foundational Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment European and Euro-American thinking was property. And of course, coming from a lefty family in Iran, that came as a massive shock to me. So that, and then the idea that the common sense actually could be something so radically different in different parts of the world, which is now, of course, you know, when we talk about hegemony or when we talk about, you know, cultural distinctions, this is something really obvious. But again, I hadn't quite thought about these things in a reflective sort of way. And I think that essentially took me to a politics degree. And then I fell in love with somebody and I moved with them here to the UK. I ended up here in ways that were actually incredibly fruitful and which I've never regretted, in part because I was writing my PhD at that point on Palestinians. And at the time that I was writing my PhD, this is right around September 11th, I probably wouldn't have been able to secure any kind of a job in a politics department or any others anywhere in the US, whereas SOAS was an incredibly wonderful host and home for me for 15 years. And so that journey from engineering to management consulting and then through a whole series of different kinds of projects, all of which seem like all over the place, but which have a core that attaches all of them, is sort of the traveling that I have been doing for the last 20 some years, 30 some years, gosh, 30 some years. So yeah.
Yeah, movement, this kind of sort of discourses of movement, how we think about movement, different logistics of movement, different types of forced and unforced movement, obviously are kind of a key theme across your work. It's so interesting to hear you speak about this revelation that is kind of the reverse of the revelation that a lot of other people in academia, I think, experience, which is, you know, you begin, you know, you absorb, you lock, you kind of assume a kind of proprietarian basis to some of these things, and the revelation goes the other way. Suddenly you think, oh, actually, I'm going to question this. Whereas it's so interesting that yours was the other way around.
I suppose it is in part because I grew up in Iran, and again in a lefty family in which the property was not the common sense. You know, I think that helped in some ways because it always put me outside of all received wisdom. In ways that have been quite useful. But it has also been it was also very useful, but it has also been very useful since then on every project that I have worked on, because I have always started with the question of what is it that this thing that we're looking at, is it really what it seems? And the apparatuses of explanation that are built around whatever it is that I've researched, everything from the ways in which Palestinians remember their past to the counterinsurgency doctrines that I avidly read, to the questions of, you know, the ports and the transport infrastructures that are so central to the way capitalism operates today. I've always looked at them and I thought, is this really all that there is? And beyond that surface, beyond the aesthetic beauty of the ports, or beyond the horror of the pictures from Abu Ghraib, or beyond the sort of the everyday ceremonies of remembrance in Palestinian refugee camps, what movements of history can we discern? And I think that has remained a constant concern of mine. I'm interested in the sort of the detailed and the textured, but I'm also really particularly interested in the kind of the bigger movements behind the texture and the detail and the micropolitics.
Mm-hmm. And actually, this kind of process of discernment that's kind of capturing the vast and the intimate. Often in your work, at the center of that is a precarious figure, a mobile figure. I mean, I'll admit to everyone that, you know, it's your work on seafarers that has kind of particularly, it's been a particular interest to me. But of course, it's not just seafarers as kind of precarious figures
Yeah.
who've been at the centre of your work. Can I get you to speak a little bit more about this idea, I suppose, of the precarious subject, that this questioning of the obvious sort of apparatus
Yeah.
of aesthetic beauty or of horror has kind of often sort of led you to and sort of centres a lot of your work.
So, again, this might have something to do with the fact that I was raised where I was raised, and in the circumstances in which I was raised. So, my family were revolutionaries in Iran, and they were political prisoners there. And when I left because I wouldn't have been able in 1985 to go to university there because of these political sort of activities that were considered in one's admission to university, and so there was, and then there was actually a sort of a broader theoretical conception of the way that the world is organized, which was very materialist. And so the question of precarity, or the question of the underdog, actually, in some ways, is one that has consumed me from the first. And in some ways, that that underdog has the person who is in an asymmetrical relationship of power, whether it's with the forces of capital or with the forces of counterinsurgency or settler colonialism in the case of Palestinians, has been always very central to my interests and my the sort of the heart of my research. So if I go backwards in what I'm researching, I think for me what was particularly fascinating about the seafarers was the world that they construct around their lives. Often, so many of them, the vast majority of the seafarers, spend many months at sea. It is often at once a very claustrophobic space of work and also quite lonesome, which because you're spending so much time with just a very small handful of people all the time. And I think that sort of combination often leads to a lot of issues with sort of mental health and also physical health. And so one of my interests from the first was to actually also look at the way that these folks managed to make a life through what was in essence quite a difficult set of circumstances. And of course they do in extraordinary sorts of ways. The comradeships that you have on board the ships, the sort of the courage and sense of humor that they show, but also the broader kind of structural conditions that produces the condition of seafaring and solidarity and mobility. And as I've been reminded by some seafarers themselves, also professionalism at sea. All of these are something that I've been wanting to sort of excavate, to work on, and in some ways that those precarious subjects, and their precarity comes because essentially seafarers are probably the largest community of gig workers in a sense. Very few seafarers are permanently employed. They go from contract to contract to contract, often with different employers. They could be very lucky if they end up on a ship that is not flagged to a flag of convenience. And so in some ways it is an incredibly precarious job, made more precarious by such things as, for example, COVID closures, both the pandemic itself and the closure of the borders, or by sort of breakages in supply chains, everything from the threat and reality of piracy to Suez Canal being blocked, to, there's a whole range of different ways in which their lives are structured by this. But then I was interested also before them in the kinds of prisoners that were captured in counterinsurgency. And some of those folks were also logistics workers. Some of the most horrific stories that came out of, for my second book, some of the most horrific stories that came out were, for example, of Nepalese drivers that ended up, being shipped in to Kuwait and then being sent to the front line in Iraq to carry goods for US forces. And then they were captured and beheaded, or captured and killed on camera. And these are these logistic workers that have nothing to do with the invasion. They have nothing to do with the war itself, but they're caught in the middle of it. Much the same way that there's these seafarers that may have nothing to do with the Iran and Iraq war, but during the tanker wars between 84 and 88, they were the main casualties of the violence that was going on in that war between the two countries. And so I'm interested in that. To what extent do we make the world that we make in? Whether through these acts of comradeship, solidarity, living together, breaking bread together, and to what extent are our lives constrained by these broader forces, whether it's capital or war, counterinsurgency, or logistics. And so I think that has been a concern, and I think it comes out of a particular kind of politics of having lived through a revolution. And so on the one hand, being very aware of the transformations a revolution brings about, but also being very deeply, intimately, personally aware of the fact that revolutions also eat their children, as famously was said after the French Revolution.
Yeah, this tension between the large forces and the intimate solidarities. Yeah, it's so kind of visceral in your work, and often that comes through like obviously a really experienced, adept, gracious interviewer. I feel very conscious interviewing you because as someone who does a lot of interviewing as part of their research practice, that's so cool. Can I get you to reflect a little bit on that, actually, from perhaps early interviews to more recent interviews, and the interview, I suppose, is we're going to get on and talk about other forms of genre of writing and literature, but perhaps that idea of the interview.
Well, you are a very gracious interviewer. Far
Wasn't fishing, really.
Well, you got it. You are very gracious, and the preparation you do, and all of that. And I do want to recognize that, and I'm very grateful for that. So it is quite interesting because, of course, part of I mean, I have learned. So part of the one constant in the ways in which I've hoped to approach my research has been to constantly imagine myself as a student of what it is that I'm researching rather than as an expert in it. Because I think a certain degree of humility and a recognition that one is not all that is quite useful for that. This is in part comes out of my forever and ever imposter syndrome, which I have always talked about. It doesn't matter. I'm a professor. I can't pretend to, to not, I'm in a position of extraordinary privilege. But I still do have an imposter syndrome. So that also helps to some extent. But then I also have learned in incredible sorts of ways from my interlocutors. So the first set of research that I did in the Palestinian refugee camps in southern Beirut, my gatekeeper was a person who has become a friend now. And she helped me out with introducing me to folks. And she helped me with sitting in some of the interviews, because although I understand Arabic, there were sometimes people spoke with accent or I couldn't articulate something. So she was going to help me out with that as well. And so and I learned from her, actually, because she knew how to speak to our interlocutors about some of the subjects that were so incredibly intensely difficult to talk about. And I think that obviously, one is tactful, one is caring. You don't excavate or extract what people don't want to. But it was also amazing to see her engage in that level. And so her name is Kholoud Hussein. She lives in Burj al Barajna camp in Beirut, and she is extraordinary, in part because she never finished high school, because and she's an autodidact. So she's not bound by the kinds of rules and norms that we are taught to do these kinds of things. So the reason she was never able to finish high school was because she grew up, she's exactly my age, and she grew up in the midst of the Lebanese civil war. And so, but she taught herself several languages, including English. And I think she speaks a little bit of Italian. She became this incredible kind of an interlocutor for researchers that came in. She has an unbelievable sense of humor. She is incredibly warm. And so she became this kind of a person that, as I said, she's like my sister. She's my age, and we always joke. And as in over the years, I go back to visit, I always make a point of having this, the maintaining this relationship, which is, of course, enormously significant to me and continues to be significant. And so I think I learned from her. But I do think that the one rule I would say is just a sense of humility, and that we don't know everything that there is to know. We simply don't, not at the best of times, and otherwise we wouldn't be having that conversation. And it is in a conversation that much comes out. And so that would be the one I think that that would be the one rule I would say. The other thing that actually helped with the shipping stuff was that I actually had no idea how things worked. So it wasn't even it wasn't even a pose of humility. I was literally like, so how does this work? And they would, and of course people do like to explain things, and so you would have these explanations, and it's in that conversation that friendships emerge, that a sort of a kind of a dialogic relationship emerges, which produces really lovely insights and relations, social relations, because obviously knowledge production is about those sets of social relations as well.
Mm. So a sense of humility, but also a sense of humour, and I suppose that kind of the movements between seriousness and humour are something that are sort of part of the way in which you handle social media. And I sort of wanted to ask you a little bit about your use of social media, how you kind of manage that, limit it, blow it apart. I think you have some sort of rules
Yes,
for using
I
social
do.
media, and perhaps humor is one of those rules.
Humor
Yeah.
is one of them. I'm actually in person. I'm not really that funny. My husband says that I'm his straight man, and he's right because he's actually really funny. And so I tend to be slightly funnier in on Twitter only because I have time to compose it. You know how when you meet somebody and somebody says something and then you think of something really funny to say in response 5 hours later? That's me all the time. And being able to be funny in writing is a much easier thing than to be immediately witty, which is one of my, as I said, one of my husband's incredible skills. But on Twitter, when I first decided to shift to Twitter, I did so because I found Facebook too intimate. The sort of the being able to write a lot, having these particular kinds of friendship as the terminology that establishes your relationship on Facebook changes the dynamics a lot. And I found the intimacy in there sometimes too stressful. And so I shifted to Twitter with sort of hearing that it was going to be this terrible place and people do pylons and things like that. And I've actually found Twitter absolutely amazing, in part because I only follow people that I really think that all the time are producing material. They don't get involved in a huge number of fights, maybe a couple of sort of media figures, Ash Sarkar of Novara, etc., who like to get involved in fights. I follow them sometimes, but most of the people that I follow are academics or people who are working on logistics or shipping or oil, the kinds of subjects that I'm interested in. And so by following them, I actually have a very specific sort of set of things in mind. The second thing is I don't, unless I can I recognize somebody, I don't engage with trolls. I don't feel like I have to sort of respond to everything that is said to me online, and I certainly immediately block anybody who is even in the least bit abusive. And so once you follow those rules, it becomes actually really, really lovely. It becomes a space of learning. I'm constantly seeing materials posted online that I would have otherwise had no access to. For example, to give you a very recent example, everything that is going on in Sudan right now, the violence between the military and the rapid forces, that is driving a lot of people, that is killing a lot of people, but is also driving a lot of people out of Khartoum and Omdurman and other places. If it weren't for Twitter, I'm not entirely sure that we would hear all of the big, terrible events that are happening there. I don't see very much of what is happening in Sudan covered in the mainstream press. And so I think that in some ways, for me, Twitter has been an incredible lifeline. And I think by just having those kinds of rules of not engaging with trolls and looking at it as a tool of learning, it actually has been a really lovely space for me. I really can't complain.
Mm-hmm. So that's one of your many, I suppose, modes of writing.
Yeah.
And I know that you write, well, you're interested in all sorts of different texts. So one of the things I enjoy about your writing are those kind of movements back to movement as our theme, between perhaps a moment from an interview and then a reference to a novel or a literary text, that might then kind of segue into something about a sort of large legal document, for
Yeah.
example, and that sort of movement between different modes of expression, different textualities, different oralities. And I know that you teach writing as a skill, and different modes of writing as a skill. So you write for the LRB, you write on Twitter, obviously you write big academic books. Can you give us a little bit of a sort of a sense of actually that pedagogical work, that sort of meta pedagogical work that you do around writing for a public audience, writing for an academic audience, and kind of that in between?
I think in a way, I mean, I grew up as an engineer. Engineers are not supposed to be able to write very well. So I had to learn how to write an academic text. And so I always found models that I wanted to emulate, people who wrote in beautiful ways or in very clear sorts of ways or in ways that were quite appealing. And that always helped. But I also always found um, there's a particular kind of self-importance sometimes around academic writing, which doesn't allow room for us to experiment with other genres of writing. And having grown up with literature, having been an extremely avid reader, in fact, all of the books you see behind me are novels and poetry. All my academic books are at work. I don't have the academic books at home. Having those, I always felt that these kinds of works had a lot more texture, a lot more richness, and in some ways they sometimes offered windows into the material that I wanted to understand that was better, that was clearer than an academic text. And so in some ways, because of this respect for different kinds of genres of writing, it has always been something that I felt one has to learn to both appreciate and perhaps also to write in different registers. There's also another element. Again, as I said, I love being a student with everything that I'm working with. And one of the pleasures of learning different genres of writing is the fact that you're essentially a student in them. So when I first started reading a lot of Supreme Court documents or legal documents for my counterinsurgency book, it takes some, you need to learn how to read these legal texts. There is a particular language, there's a particular cadence, there's a particular way of sort of structuring the narrative that is really fascinating. And then, of course, all of the attachments, the precedents, which precedent is cited. Are they cited in the body? Or are they cited in the footnote? How are they doing that? And so the deconstructing that legal genre is always really interesting to me. Really fascinating. One of the more fascinating, for example, recent activist documents that I have seen was a document that a bunch of anti-fossil fuel activists put together, and about how to read, for example, oil contracts, which I think is brilliant. It's like so great to be able to have somebody say to you, this is how you read this text. This is how you understand it. As academics, that's what we do, right? We teach our students not just what's in the text, but also how to read it. And so to me, that learning how to do different things has been quite fun. And then when LRB approached me to do a review for them, that to me was absolutely just, I was over the moon, in part because I love that genre of writing, which is pitched at an audience that is intelligent and would like to read, but which is not necessarily an academic audience, and certainly not there's no guarantee that somebody in your discipline is going to read what you're writing for them. And they have amazing editors, as I have learned. And of course, having a good editor is just the best gift God can give you. And so that experience has also been very different for me, because I feel that whereas in academic writing, every statement that I make needs to be qualified and supported and evidenced in ways that fit the conventions of that writing, LRB, or writing this essay for a more public audience, gives you the chance to maybe step a little bit outside your comfort zone and make an argument that is a bit bigger than you would do without necessarily having the evidence. Not being able to, for example, footnote everything that you're doing is actually terrifying and also liberating, because you have to make sure that what you say in the body of the text is going to be persuasive without the apparatuses on which we depend in order to make sure we know what we're talking about. And again, I'm really grateful because, of course, LRB also has amazing fact checkers. So they make sure that they catch, if I make errors or if I make claims that or can't be supported, they catch it as well. So that is part of the fun of it. I'm finding that writing for the LRB for the last 2 or 3 years has been unbelievably useful in trying to sketch the next big projects I'm going to have, because they're allowing me to think about the subjects that I like at a slightly further remove than I ordinarily would have done for some of the academic books that I have done before this.
That's really interesting, actually, to think about that mode of writing as actually feeding back into the research rather than being alongside it or an endpoint to it. That it actually is a driver to write in this slightly different way.
It's a starting point. It's absolutely a starting point, because I feel like I'm making really big claims in some of the stuff that I'm writing, and then I'm thinking, okay, well, if I were to write an academic book based on this big claim, what evidence would I need? So it becomes like the sort of this is where I'm going to start. This is the wager. This is the intellectual wager that I'm going to make in this LRB piece, and then I'm going to eventually write that book to support it with all of the necessary historical, archival, interview, whatever detail it needs.
So you talk about the importance of a good editor, and you appreciate a good editor, and you yourself, of course, have edited works. And I was just looking this morning at the editorial for the 2013 special issue of Feminist Review on water, so 10 years ago. And you write there about wanting to interrogate and hopefully shift the current scholarly debate on water. So, you're pitching this special issue that you edited towards opening up a new kind of conversation around water. Can I, as a way of sort of bringing you back to ports, and I know some of the work that you're wanting to do, but can I? What do you think about that 10 years? How do you think that debates on water and indeed on feminism perhaps have changed over the 10 years?
Absolutely, and it's kind of funny because I haven't actually. I got your email, but I was in the midst of doing some other stuff, so I haven't gone back to read
No,
to the editorial, and I'm like in horror of how awful it must be, but it can't be that awful. And part of the reason that it can't be that awful is because what I remember from that issue was that I came at water from a very I don't know, the engineer, political scientist sort of way. And what I remember from the articles in that special issue, which we edited, one was about an autoethnography of somebody who swam. And so thinking about the embodied experience of somebody in the water. The second category, and there was a couple of those, were Indigenous people, Indigenous women in Hawaii writing about water, both in literary terms in Hawaiian culture, but also in social scientific ways about settler sort of culture in Hawaii. And then another article that was in there was about, actually, this was about the migrants that were shipped from Australia to detention centers, island detention centers. And so I'm looking back at that and I'm thinking, actually, it is really interesting because those 2013 articles, which obviously we had to start probably in 2011 in order to get them into that special issue, are prescient in ways that I definitely cannot take claim for, because it is about embodiment. It's about migrants and their terrible treatment, which of course, starting in the summer of 2013, we saw the Mediterranean deaths of people trying to cross the Mediterranean and being shunted back by horrific kind of Fortress Europe type policies, and questions around indigeneity and natural resources or stewardship. Natural resource actually sounds so capitalist. Stewardship of earth and water. And so I'm looking back and going, wow, there are some really amazing people who work in these fields. And so I feel very lucky to have been exposed to that so long ago. Although, as I said, I shudder in horror about How terrible. and
That's a
and
beautiful.
outdated
No.
Ruth Whitson, my introduction may have been for that. So yeah.
No, it's a beautiful issue with a beautiful introduction.
Good.
It
Oh,
was very nice to
it's
go
not
back to it.
embarrassing.
No, not at all. It was nice, and it was interesting to go back to it because it yeah, I was sort of slightly surprised to think, gosh, yeah, it's 10 years.
Yeah.
10 years. And there's something about the decade, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Mediterranean, which is a sea that is important to you in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
And actually, our conversation before this conversation took me to Mediterranean noir.
Yes.
And you're interested in the Mediterranean noir, and I've bought the first of Jean-Claude Izzo's
Did
detective
you?
fiction
Excellent.
in preparation possibly for reading another perhaps new writer on the scene in the field of detective fiction.
So for years and years and years and years, I have been dying to write a detective novel. It's one of my favorite genres, in part because I think it's a genre that can be very political without being didactic, as like, for example, Izzo is. And so, and Izzo was such a huge influence that I actually made trips to Marseille just to follow his footsteps in different places. But what I'm hoping to do, since I'm going to be commuting down to Exeter, my friend Sophie Harmon has suggested that I use my commute time to write a detective novel, which is what I've been wanting to do. And so who knows, maybe in a couple of years you'll have, and the detective novels are going to take place in ports in the Middle East, because I figure all of that research could be, put together, put to much more interesting use. And so, yeah, so keep an eye out. Maybe I will, if I now, by saying this in public, maybe this will force me to actually go and write that detective novel.
And actually, it's probably quite a good length of writing time. That
Yes.
trip from London to Exeter, you can
2.5 hours. Perfect.
Yeah, you can get a little bit of a chapter done. And
yeah, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Oh, thank you so much for all those thoughts, moving across lots of different subjects and topics about movement. I think we should probably now segue into picking up some questions from the audience. So if people have questions, can you please just put them in the chat? We're quite a big group, so I apologise for not sort of opening things up so that people can voice their questions. But we're trying to keep these conversations, to time and manageable. So I have a question here from Saeed. Such an inspiring talk. Thanks very much, Laleh. Did you detect any patterns or mechanisms behind phenomena in engineering or management disciplines that you found useful and applicable in PAIR? That's a very nice question. We'll come back to the logistics.
It's a brilliant question. And I think that in some ways, okay, so I was grateful to have done the engineering degree and to have worked as a management consultant for several reasons. One, it gave me a kind of a familiarity with the broader languages that are used in the field of logistics, shipping, maritime transport in ways that were quite useful because we all obviously all operate in different sets of jargons. And so that jargon for me was rusty, but I managed to excavate it. And so that was useful. It was also useful in another way. And that was that as an academic, if you go in and you say that you are an engineer or have an experience of engineering or management consulting, there's a certain degree of legitimacy that gives you that is also extremely useful when speaking to people. In terms of, I'm actually really interested in the political mechanisms underlying decisions in both engineering and management consulting. And when I was asked to review a book about McKinsey for the LRB, I ended up doing a huge amount of research for that about the field of management consulting. And I learned things that I actually had intuited from having worked for Anderson Consulting, which is today Accenture, and Pricewaterhouse, which is today PwC. and it was really fascinating for me to see that the things that I had intuited in some ways were, you know, that the work we were doing, what function it served, who we were, because we were hired often out of school, we didn't know anything, and yet we were slotted into these positions which required a certain degree of knowledge and experience from us, etc. So it was really fascinating to read about the politics that underlay that. And so I think that the patterns actually for me have gone the other way. I tend, because I was trained as a quote unquote political scientist in the US, I have an allergy towards trying to scientize social sciences. That's sort of a
Laleh, you've accidentally, I think, gone on mute somehow. I'm not sure if you.
Oh,
There
okay.
we are. If you
Okay,
could just
great.
repeat the last sort of 10
Yeah.
seconds.
Yeah, I was saying that because I have been trained in political science in the US, I have an allergy by very critical professors, so not people that weren't necessarily themselves imagining political science to be quote unquote as natural science. I find it really, really quite difficult to think about applying engineering or scientific ways of thinking, modes of thinking to social sciences, because I do think that the phenomena operate in different sorts of ways. They're obviously in conversation with one another, but I tend to take the patterns that I see in social life and apply them to the ways in which engineering and management consulting and other businesses work, rather than the other way around.
That's so interesting. I'm expecting some kind of scene in the management consultancy world to appear in the detective novel.
It definitely is going to. Oh my God, yeah. It's amazing that there are not more detective novels taking place, and there's so much intrigue that often goes on in these places, you know.
Yeah, and actually another world that fascinates you, I think, perhaps I could say, is the world of insurance.
Yes.
The politics of the culture of insurance law. Maybe there'll be a scene in insurance officers. There'll definitely be some insurance in the detective novel.
without oh yeah, well, because I didn't want to have a cop, I'm anti-carceralist, because I didn't want to have a cop as a hero. The detective is going to be an insurance claim investigator. It's also great because from what I've discovered, these insurance claim investigators tend to be incredibly sort of hardworking. They cover a lot of ground. They try to learn lots of different things, and of course they can also be women. And my character is going to be a woman, so I think that's going to be kind of fun to write. It also allows me to get into all of that finance and insurance, which I'm a complete nerd for. So
yeah, no, it's an absolutely fascinating world. Yeah. We have a question in the chat from Chris, who writes, when we write academic articles, we often have very specific audiences in mind. We may even have specific interlocutors in mind. When you write pieces, for example, for the LRB, do you have an audience in mind at all? How do you think about readership there?
a great question. So I was in the audience for the LRB since 1995 when I first got my subscription to the magazine. So I've been with them for almost 30 years. So in a way, I imagine, and when I started doing that, I was still a management consultant. I hadn't even started the master's program yet. And so it was, to me, what was really fascinating was that I found myself reading essays that they had written about politics, but I would also read the essays that, for example, they had Mary Beard writing quite a bit for them, writing stuff about, I don't know, the Roman, victory marches. And I would find reading about extremely obscure Victorian novelists, which LRB excels in. And then they would have people like Stephen Shapin, who's a STS scholar or historian of science scholar at Harvard today, but used to be in the UK somewhere. Always wrote amazing, fascinating stuff about sort of the politics of scientific discovery. And so I would be reading all of these because they all were interesting. I think what bound what binds LRB together in ways that, for example, the New York Review doesn't, is that it is far more varied in its interest than the New York Review is. The New York Review tends to have a slightly narrower set of interests and tends to be a lot more political, actually, or has a lot more articles about politics than the LRB does. So I always found that really fascinating. I always found the fact that you could jump from these incredibly different venues of conversation to other ones, or from very different sets of audiences to other ones. I found that really, really, really great. And so when I write for them, I imagine somebody like me who is interested, but not necessarily an expert, but is also, I'm hoping that it is, that the audience is also going to become interested in some of the subjects that I'm writing. And so I try to bring in other elements into it. Although I'm definitely not a literary scholar, I try to sort of bring in some passages or quotations from literary sources that could potentially illuminate the kinds of social scientific stuff that I'm talking about. And so I think, again, as I think about that audience, I'm hoping that it is a broader audience and one that is curious about a load of different things, and not necessarily somebody who works on shipping or somebody who works on the Middle East, or the subjects that are of interest to me.
Yeah, once again, that kind of it's so interesting when you say, I think about my sort of yourself, a past self as a reader, and that past self being someone who's kind of transitioning from management consultancy to some other kind of mode of being in the world. It's really interesting idea of a readership that others of us might sort of keep in mind in some of our writing. We have a question in the chat from Renee, who writes, in Sinews of War and Trade, you describe how the genre of speculation is very much sustained by maritime logistics, speculative pricing, future contracts, forward-looking statements, etc. How could we, in our writing or thinking, possibly stage a critical encounter with the ephemerality of this logistical speculation?
Wow.
Beautiful
that is
question.
an amazing question. Okay, so there is a way to sustain a critical encounter with speculation, and I'm going to touch on the ephemerality in a moment. I think through a whole series of different mechanisms. I think that there's been a lot more interest by social scientists who are not involved in business or economics in the ways in which the politics of speculation, the politics of futures works. A lot more historians also with this kind of a last 10, 15 years of interest in new histories of capitalism. There's been also a lot more interest in histories of finance. And so one of the first books that I read about forward contracts actually was this wonderful, beautiful history of Chicago by William Cronon, whose name the name of the book escapes me. But if you are at all interested, this is an amazing book. And so in some ways that historical account of the first time that futures contracts around actually the commodities market in Chicago emerges in the 19th century, 18th and late 18th and beginning of throughout 19th century in Chicago. That book was actually shattering to me. It was brilliant. It was so amazing. And then I read, and this is going to be completely in the other direction, I read Zong, the poem by Noor Besser Phillips. And Noor Besser Phillips is themselves both a poet and a legal scholar. At the end of that amazing, stunning long poem about a slave ship, Zong, they have an essay which actually explains the legal case around Zong, in which some 100 people were thrown overboard. Some 100 enslaved Africans were thrown overboard by the ship captain, and then a court case emerged around it, around insurance, actually, in the UK, and it is fascinating because you see the ways in which the first lineaments of finance in its modern form is emerging around this insurance case, this speculative case about the value of the human. Is it a human? Is the person that had been killed a human, or are they a piece of cargo? And I think that it is lacerating both the poem, but also the legal essay that follows it. And so to me, that combination of those two things were actually really, really important to, in some ways, understand both the historical account of the emergence of these kinds of speculative elements and the way that they were seated within a whole set of social and historical relations, but also the import of them and just the meaning of what it means to be a person in legal documents, but also in poetry. So in some ways, for me, that critical encounter needs to be constantly reproduced, and we have to have the due respect for the subjects of that encounter. But then there's the question of ephemerality, and I think that you're absolutely right to put that in there, and that's part of the reason what makes your question actually much more difficult to answer than a quick conversation in this forum allows. And I think the ephemerality comes from, to some extent, the opacity of finance, to some extent, the fact that the models that are built to deal with these forms of speculation mess with time in ways that are difficult to grasp and demand a rethinking of how time functions, which stands outside the kind of linear or cyclical time to which we're accustomed in the vernacular. And I think if we are to engage with the ephemerality of these futures contracts, I think that what it would require is for us to think about the way that new perceptions of time are constantly being hoisted through these models, and what these new perceptions of time are doing to us, thinking about the present, but thinking about how we think about the future. Because I do think that these speculative instruments are also enormously instrumental in the way that we are rushing towards the destruction of the planet. I think the derivatives options and other speculative financial instruments have been enormously detrimental. And so I think that if we are to think about that ephemerality, we have to face the way that time comes into this, both at the incredibly banal level of how is a futures contract constructed to deal with tomorrow, but also in the much more metaphysical and perhaps existential sense of how does this futures contract affect the possibility of being alive in 100 years or 200 years, or to be alive in a livable planet or unlivable planet.
Yeah, the unrelentingness of the kind of temporalities of capitalism again is a kind of I suppose a constant theme across your work, and perhaps becoming ever more central. We have a question from Ryan. The link to Zong and the legal essay at the end of it also connects to Melville's Benito Sereno, which does the same thing, thinking about the Haitian uprising and the legal fallout of that, and the slave uprising on the ship. Just a comment, not a question.
But it's a brilliant comment, and I love Benito Sereno, like everything else of Melville's that I love. I mean, I if you could see back behind me, there's like a ton of stuff that references the Moby Dick and other books of his behind me. I think that you're absolutely right. And I do actually think that Haiti is in some ways the beginning of the modern times in ways that people are beginning to recognize more and more. I just finished teaching a course on, a course on revolutions, where I forced my second year students to actually read a book from the beginning to end. And the book that I chose was Black Jacobins, because I felt that in some ways they needed to become familiar with this classic. But this, they're hearing a lot more about Haiti being incredibly important as this sort of a year zero of the modern world in which we live. But then to read it also in this extraordinary prophetic language, beautiful style of writing that James had. And so yes, Haiti is important in literature, it's important historically, it's important artistically. It's such a sort of as I said, it's extraordinarily important, and I'm really glad you brought up Benito Sereno. Thank you.
Fantastic. And yeah, conversations kind of coming back to sea, to narratives of the sea, literature of the sea. There's a wonderful piece by Toni Morrison about Melville and Benito Cereno as well, that is that I find very helpful myself in teaching that text on a second year module. So yeah, it's wonderful to that you've put that the one book that you get your students to read cover to cover is James. That's fantastic. Yeah. So you spoke sort of in answering Renee's question. You know, you brought up I suppose the sense of a less than pleasurable future fast coming towards us. But your writing, your thinking in both your public life and academic life, and the way that you bring those together, also touches on sort of more pleasurable, happy subjects. You can see I'm trying to move us towards
a hopeful ending.
Perhaps a hopeful ending to the conversation. So you write beautifully about cooking. You know, you've reviewed some cookbooks, and you know the material, the sort of material pleasures in life. Can I get you to speak a little bit about that? The way in which your writing is also engaged, I suppose, with I mean, we began by talking a little bit about seafarers, I suppose, obviously a very, you know, a community are hugely at risk, barely rights bearing, if at all, but also a community of solidarity, of you know, sharing bread. So I was wondering if we could perhaps
I'll end with food because it is always such a great
food.
subject, and I'm a glutton, and I love both eating and cooking, and of course during COVID, I think people think that you mentioned something about how I was going to be writing a cookbook, and I was like, no, I'm not. It's just people have been saying that because I've been posting these pictures of cooking. You know, in COVID we all did crazy things, like I made xiaolong baos at home, I made pasta at home, you know, things that I never do. I now basically, you know, try to cook as quickly as I can, but you had all this time, and cooking was incredibly restorative in some ways. So that was really lovely. But the idea of food also is unbelievably central. Yeah, food definitely does mean a lot to us Iranians, but also the Arabs. Also, I mean, I'm sure if you've been to any of the countries around the Mediterranean where people have small dishes, whether it's the mezzas or the tapas or whatever, food is so central to the social life that people construct.
Laleh, I've accidentally knocked mute on again. There not sure.
Okay. Okay,
yes.
I was able to do it now. And so I think that food is really incredibly important as a form of sociality, as a form of connection, and certainly with the seafarers, you know, when you're at sea, the food that you eat matters. Actually, a lot of this seafarer sort of political mobilization is around hunger ships, or is around the sort of the question of eating. And so I think food has this both extremely functional, instrumental role in the way we live, but also enormously important as a way of living together, as a way of eating together. In every culture, breaking bread is considered to be, if you eat with someone, there's a kind of hospitality involved in that allows for comradeship and friendship and solidarity. Of course, it's also it could be a source of hierarchy or asymmetry, but I think I'd rather think of it as a venue, as a conduit of connection and pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Conduits of connection is a beautiful note on which to end. Thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us. Just before we go, just a little bit of an advertisement for an upcoming public life event. We will have Kate Crawford with us on the 29th of June, who will be talking about artificial intelligence. and perhaps other forms of art and other forms of intelligence. If you would like to follow the Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities events, Anushka, our wonderful, marvellous social media expert, has put a link in the chat, so you can click through there and sort of become part of our community. You know, you can use the Institute as a conduit for connection, which is what we want the Institute to be, a conduit for connection, a bit like food. Thank you so much. And
thank you, Stephanie, and thank you also to both Claire and Anushka who helped with all of the organizations and things. So I'm very grateful. This was fun. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Right.
Take care. And thank you to also all the lovely audience and the wonderful questions.